If you walked into the Hale household on a Sunday morning in Georgia, you'd find a woman ironing her son's church shirt with military precision while humming old hymns about salvation and wrath. That woman was Linda Hale, a widow, a Bible teacher, and a firm believer that love had rules. And her son, Cameron, had spent his childhood learning exactly where he didn't belong inside those rules. By the time he was 12, Cameron had memorized more verses about hell than stories about love. He learned to smile when Linda said, "I'd rather bury a son than see him kiss another man." It wasn't just a comment, it was a weekly sermon in their kitchen, their car, their living room, wherever she thought the devil might be listening. For Cameron, it was never safe to speak the truth, not even in a whisper. His truth had to be buried deeper than prayer, because in his mother's house, God listened and God judged. Cameron was good at pretending. He laughed at the right jokes in youth group. He dated a girl for a few months just to make Linda proud. He kept a straight posture, a straight voice, a straight face, but behind closed doors. When the lights were off and the silence crept in, he'd stand in front of the mirror and ask one quiet question. What if I can't change? The answers never came. Only shame. He tried everything, praying until his throat burned, cold showers, fasting. He even kept a rubber band around his wrist and snapped it every time his eyes lingered too long on a boy. The pain was supposed to remind him of sin, but it only reminded him that he existed in a body that his mother might never love again if she knew who he really was. Cameron's home was not a violent one, but silence could be sharp too. It cut him slowly, without bleeding. The day Linda found a hidden journal under his mattress with drawings, thoughts, and feelings he couldn't say out loud, she didn't scream, she didn't hit him. She just stood at the doorway, pale and shaking, and said 4 words. "I don't know you." And that was worse than any slap. That was the day her son disappeared from her memory. Not through disease, but by choice. Cameron was 16 when he was forced to leave. Linda didn't tell the neighbors. She said he got a scholarship out of town. What she didn't say was that she had packed his bag and left it on the porch with a Bible on top. Open to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Cameron never opened that Bible again. Years passed. Cameron moved to Seattle, trained as a senior caregiver, and kept his last name out of professional documents. He told people his parents had died. It was easier than explaining the grief of being erased while still alive. He built a quiet, good life, steady job, safe apartment, no big declarations. No need to explain, but the past has a strange way of calling back. On a cold Tuesday in October, his aunt called. Linda had been diagnosed with mid-stage Alzheimer's. She couldn't afford long-term care, and the family had scattered. The woman who had once thrown her son away now sat alone in a dim living room, forgetting her own name some days. And somehow, the only person willing to come home was him. Cameron booked a flight without telling anyone. Not even Quincy, his colleague and closest friend, who had once said, "You don't have to go back to where you weren't loved." But Cameron wasn't going back for love. He was going back for something else. Maybe closure, maybe courage, or maybe just to see if the woman who once said, "I'd rather bury a son than love a gay one," still remembered how to hold his hand. And for the first time in years, he stepped back into that house. Same creaking floors, same lemon soap smell, same photo of Linda and his late father on the mantle, frozen in time. But Linda didn't recognize him. She blinked twice, then smiled. "You look like someone I used to love," she said. Cameron didn't know whether to cry or breathe. Do you believe people can change when memory fades, but the heart stays? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to follow Heartstories for more stories that heal, confront, and move you. Cameron sat beside her the first evening like he would with any new client. He laid out medications, adjusted the lighting, and asked simple questions about meals and preferences. Linda answered politely, like speaking to a neighbor's child she couldn't quite place. She was thinner than he remembered, her once perfectly styled curls now tangled with sleep. But her eyes, those sharp, judgmental eyes, had softened. She looked at him like he was someone safe. Over the next few days, she began calling him Matthew. He didn't correct her. Maybe Matthew was someone she trusted in a memory he never knew. She asked him to read from her old Bible, and when he opened to Psalms, she nodded and whispered, "That's the one my boy used to love." Cameron wanted to laugh at the irony, but the lump in his throat didn't let him. He called Quincy after the first week. Quincy, ever loyal, flew down and stayed in the guest room. To Linda, he was just a nice young man with kind hands. At dinner, when she saw the two of them laughing over an old video on Cameron's phone, she smiled and said something that stopped time. "You two make a sweet couple." Cameron dropped his fork. Quincy looked at him and didn't say a word. Linda continued sipping her tea like it was the most natural thing in the world. In a world where she no longer knew birthdays or addresses, she had somehow made peace with something she once called an abomination. Cameron wanted to believe this was progress, that somewhere beneath the fog of her mind, a mother's love had finally learned to stretch beyond its old boundaries. But each day was different. Some mornings, she hummed church songs and asked if he had found Jesus yet. Other nights, she wept for her husband, thinking he had only just passed. And there were moments, short, piercing moments, when the old Linda flickered through. Once, she saw Quincy brush a strand of hair from Cameron's face and asked coldly, "Are you like that?" Her tone wasn't angry, it was scared. Cameron simply nodded. Linda looked away, then back again, confused, like her own thoughts were betraying her. Later that night, she didn't speak to him. She barely looked at him. He slept on the couch, unsure if the fragile truce between them had shattered. But by morning, she had forgotten it happened and greeted him with a kiss on the hand. This was the rhythm love in fragments, rejection in shadows, followed by silence, then tenderness. And through it all, Cameron stayed. Not because he was waiting for redemption, but because something inside him refused to abandon her the way she once abandoned him. One afternoon, while folding her laundry, Cameron found something folded between two pillowcases, an old church bulletin, yellowed with age. On the back was a handwritten list of prayer requests. Third on the list, under guidance for the nation and health for Sister June, were the words, "Cameron, may God fix what's broken in him." He held the paper for a long time, unsure whether to keep it or throw it in the fireplace. In the end, he folded it back into the pillowcase, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder that some wounds aren't erased. They are simply made room for. Quincy left after 3 weeks, promising to return if needed. Before boarding his flight, he pulled Cameron into a tight hug and whispered, "Don't lose yourself to trying to find her again." Cameron didn't reply, but the words echoed for days. As Linda's condition declined, she needed help with everything: bathing, dressing, eating. And though she still didn't know his name, she always reached for his hand at night. "Don't go far," she'd mumble. "I feel safe when you're near." One night, as rain tapped gently on the windows, she asked him to sit at the edge of her bed. She looked at him like she was searching for a name she no longer knew how to pronounce. "Did I ever have a son?" Cameron swallowed hard. He didn't know how to answer that. Not truthfully, not without bleeding. "Yes," he said finally, "and he loved you very much." Linda's lips curled into a weak smile. "Then I must have done something right." It was the first time in his life Cameron believed she meant it. The following weeks unfolded like pages torn from different books, none in order, none fully intact. Some days, Linda thought Cameron was her late husband. She'd ask him to fix the porch light or hum the hymn they used to dance to in the kitchen. Other days, she called him Pastor Lewis and confessed to sins that weren't her own. But every night, without fail, she asked him to stay a little longer. There was something quiet and tragic about watching someone forget who they used to be. Linda, once so sure of her beliefs, now wavered like her hands did when she tried to drink water. Cameron sometimes caught her looking at the family portrait on the wall, frowning, then shaking her head like the people inside it didn't belong to her anymore. He thought about removing it, but couldn't. The woman in that photograph was still her, still the same eyes, the same hands that had once held his face and said, "You are not what God intended," and the same hands that now trembled when reaching for a fork. Cameron kept his journal beside her bed. Every night, after she fell asleep, he'd write down what she said that day, what she remembered, what she forgot. He did it not because he needed the record, but because, somewhere deep down, he feared the forgetting too. Forgetting why he came back. Forgetting the boy he used to be. Forgetting that forgiveness, when it comes, often arrives without ceremony or certainty. There were moments, though brief, almost impossible moments, when it felt like Linda was reaching back through the fog. Once, while brushing her hair, she asked, "Why does my heart feel like it's missing someone?" Cameron didn't answer. He just kept brushing, slowly, gently. Then she added, "It's not a bad feeling, just like someone I should have held on to longer." Another evening, as he was helping her into bed, she placed a frail hand on his wrist and whispered, "Thank you for not leaving me. I wouldn't have stayed for me." It was the kind of line that clung to his chest long after the lights went out. But just as he began to believe that healing could come without full recognition, Linda had one of her worst days. She didn't recognize the house, thought the hallway led to a school she once taught at. She grew agitated, accusing Cameron of trying to trick her. She locked herself in the bathroom and screamed for her real family. The nurse, the police, the Lord. Cameron sat outside the door, heart thudding, listening to the woman who once raised him now begged to be rescued from his presence. It wasn't new pain, but it was old pain revived, sharp and merciless. He wanted to walk out, just like she once did to him. But he didn't. He waited. 30 minutes later, she opened the door, eyes vacant, breathing uneven. Then she leaned into his chest without a word. He wrapped his arms around her gently, and she said, almost inaudibly, "You feel like home." In the weeks that followed, her physical strength faded faster than her memory. She began eating less, sleeping more. Cameron adjusted the schedule, took time off work, rearranged the house for wheelchair access. He never called it sacrifice. He called it showing up. Because for once, she couldn't walk away. And he wouldn't. One afternoon, while sorting linens, Cameron discovered something wedged between the cushions of her favorite chair, a folded note, handwritten in his mother's careful, curling script. It wasn't recent. The ink was faded, the paper soft with age. It read, "If I ever forget the people I love, I hope they remember that I was trying, even when I failed." Especially then, it wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. That night, Cameron sat beside her bed as she slept. He didn't cry. He just held her hand and read from the journal. Little things she'd said, the time she offered him her last bite of pudding, the time she said his laugh reminded her of her son, the time she asked if she'd ever held a baby, and when he showed her a photo of himself as an infant. She wept without knowing why. The pain was still there, the distance, the past, but so was something else, something quiet, almost holy. There are people we lose all at once, and there are people we lose slowly, piece by piece, and sometimes they come back in pieces too. There was a stillness that began to settle over the house, like the slow descent of snow before a long winter. Linda's moments of awareness grew shorter, but gentler. She didn't fight the fog anymore. Some days, she barely opened her eyes. But when she did, her gaze almost always fell on Cameron, and she smiled softly, wordlessly, like something in her recognized his presence, even if not his name. Cameron kept the rhythm of care going: morning sponge baths, soft foods, medication at precisely timed intervals. He rarely left the house now, save for brief walks to clear his mind. Quincy called every other day, offering updates from Seattle and always ending with the same words, "You're stronger than you think, Cam." But strength didn't feel like the right word for what he was doing. It felt more like surrender. A quiet surrender to time, to tenderness, to the understanding that love, even when not returned fully, still had meaning. One morning, as Cameron changed the sheets, He came across a worn cassette tape buried in the nightstand drawer. The label read Sunday Choir 1996. He found an old player in the attic, dusted it off, and pressed play. The tape hissed, then filled the room with the haunting sound of Linda's voice, clear, vibrant, unwavering, leading Paul, a church congregation, in a hymn he hadn't heard in years. Come thou fount of every blessing. Linda stirred in her chair, eyes fluttering open. She turned her head slowly toward the sound. Her lips moved, almost silently, tracing the words as if they were stitched into her bones. When the song ended, she looked at Cameron and whispered, "That voice used to sound so sure of everything. Did it help anyone?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the side drawer and took out the small leather notebook he'd been filling for months, his daily entries, observations, things she said, things she forgot. He held it out to her, but Linda didn't take it. Her fingers trembled too much. So he began to read. He read about the day she called him kind. The morning she insisted he stay for breakfast because you feel like family. He read the time she said, "I hope I raised a good boy, wherever he is," not knowing she had, and that he was sitting right beside her. Linda listened, eyes fixed on him with the intensity of someone trying to solve a riddle they no longer had the language for. When he finished, she said softly, "I used to think God only lived in answers. Maybe he lives in questions too." That night, Cameron did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He brought out a framed photo of himself at 17, his high school graduation. The very day she told him not to come home if he insisted on living like that. He placed it on her bedside table, facing outward. The next morning, she noticed it, stared at it for a long time. Then she asked, "Why does that boy look like he's trying not to disappear?" Cameron sat beside her, the sunlight catching the edges of his face, and replied quietly, "Because he was." Linda reached for the frame, held it to her chest, and for a long time didn't say anything. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked like thin glass. "If you ever see him again, tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I wish I'd been brave enough to love him when it mattered most." Cameron didn't tell her. He didn't say, "It's me." He just nodded and said, "I think he'd forgive you." As fall edged into winter, Linda's health declined sharply. The house grew quieter, meals smaller, breaths slower. Cameron installed handrails in the hallway, switched her bedding to flannel, learned how to lift her without causing pain. Every act became a ritual of presence. He no longer waited for the woman she used to be. He honored the one she was now. One evening, while organizing her paperwork, he found a locked drawer in her old roll-top desk. The key was taped to the underside. Inside, among old receipts and expired ID cards, was a letter, folded once, yellowing, addressed, in Linda's handwriting, to Cameron. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. "I don't know if you'll ever read this. I'm writing it because I couldn't say it. Not then. Maybe not ever. I raised you to be obedient, to be good, but I never taught you how to be free. And when you showed me who you really were, I failed you. I let fear speak louder than love. I hope wherever you are that you found someone who tells you you're not broken, that you're enough, and that you're still soft somewhere inside, even after what I did. I pray that when I lose my memory, I don't lose the part that still loves you." No signature, just that final line. "If you see me again, please be kind. Even if I forget." That night, Cameron placed the letter beside her bed. She wouldn't recognize it, but maybe her heart would. The last week of Linda's life passed like twilight. No sharp ends, just a slow dissolving of sound and shape. She barely spoke. Her eyes often remained closed, even when she was awake. Yet every time Cameron touched her hand, her fingers curled ever so slightly in response. That was how he knew she was still there, somewhere beneath the veil of forgetting. The doctor said the end would be peaceful. They said he was doing everything right, but none of their words made the waiting easier. He found himself whispering stories to her while she slept. Little things she'd said when she was lucid. The times she called his laugh beautiful, The time she said the world should be kinder than the one she helped build. He told her things she had never remembered, but he hoped she would carry anyway. The night before she passed, something rare happened. Linda opened her eyes wide, not with confusion, but with clarity. She looked at Cameron for a long time, longer than she had in months. Then, in a voice thin as paper, she asked, "How long have you been with me?" Cameron answered, "Almost a year." "Mama." Linda nodded. Her eyes began to well, though she didn't seem afraid. She simply whispered, "You've taken care of me like I was your mother." He tried to smile through the ache in his chest. "You are," he said. She blinked slowly, her lips trembling as if on the verge of something unspeakable. Then she asked, "Did I ever have a son?" Cameron paused. The silence stretched. He thought about everything she had done, everything she had forgotten, everything he had forgiven. Then he took her hand and said softly, "Yes, and he loved you very much." Linda stared at him, her gaze steady. "Then I hope I told him that before I forgot." Cameron kissed her forehead. It was all he could do. The next morning, she was gone. There was no drama in her passing, just the quiet folding in of breath, like the final note of a lullaby. She left behind a house full of memories that only one person could still recall. And in that house, Cameron stood alone, not as a son who had been erased, but as a man who chose to remember both the love that was withheld and the love that came too late. After the funeral, Cameron returned to Seattle. He didn't bring back much, just the letter, the cassette, her favorite cardigan, and the journal he had filled over the past year. He later gave a talk at a caregivers conference. Not about Alzheimer's, not about procedures or routines, but about grace. About how sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones we end up holding when they can no longer walk, and how memory might fade, but love, when chosen daily, can still leave something behind. He ended the talk by reading Linda's final letter. He didn't explain the history. He didn't name the pain. He just let her words echo into the silence of the room. "If you see me again, please be kind, even if I forget." After the applause, a woman came up to him and said, "I don't know why, but I think my mother would have wanted me to hear that." Cameron smiled and replied, "Mine too." Well, and that's how the story ends. Not with perfect healing, not with full reconciliation, but with a choice, the choice to show up, even when the other person can't, the choice to love, even when the past didn't make room for it, the choice to remember, even when the person you loved forgot your name. Because sometimes, forgiveness isn't a moment, it's a year in a small house in Georgia, where a man took care of the mother who once said she'd rather bury him than accept who he was. But in the end, when she had nothing left but instinct, she reached for him, and that was enough. What would you do if the person who once hurt you forgot everything but still held your hand? Would you let them go or choose to stay? Let us know your thoughts below. For more deeply human, heart-touching stories like this, subscribe to Heartstories, because healing often begins with being seen, even by someone who forgot who you are. See you in the next story.